So I'm curious, if you take the sorts of things that we're talking about and you cross those things with psychoanalysis, what difference does it make in your practice or your understanding?
Well, I think when I was studying with Gene and he was my therapist for a year, the emphasis was very much on sensing myself and my own experience, and very, very, very relational in the sense that Gene was always very present and wanting to know the more of anything that was there for me. But there was also something missing for me in the interpersonal realm of intimacy with another person who was intentionally building a needed bond with me. And at that time, psychoanalysis was really very constricting. I won't even go into that. But then Kohut was coming on the scene there, and Kohut's version of psychoanalysis really spoke to that feeling of essential needs that we are playing out in therapy, and the therapist's ability to be a partner in making the relationship, the therapy relationship, a new kind of beginning, a new kind of being in that relationship. And later on, I've certainly studied many of the things that Gene has said about being the interaction that makes things better. I always love that he said in the interview, in his teaching in our course. But in psychoanalysis, the emphasis is on the therapeutic couple building the kind of relatedness that that attends to and speaks directly to past deficits and trauma and inability to connect. And it's sort of an awareness of both people in the couple, or sometimes not both people, sometimes only the therapist, but an awareness that this relationship can be very special and larger than life, and that one can live in a different way and take risks and be challenged in a different way safely than one can't in usual social connections or romantic connections. It always goes very wrong when you're trying to to play out and build something. It doesn't always go wrong, but I mean, it's much more difficult since those relationships don't have any safeguards. And the therapy relationship, it's amazing to have this kind of intimacy with safeguards, but also safe challenges. And I love the idea. I went into analysis after Gene left New York, and with my analyst, I felt challenged to try to be as real and say the things that I was afraid to say. And Gene always accepted anything I said, but there wasn't the feeling of being challenged to do that. And I sort of needed that.
What do you mean by challenge? Like, what would be an example of that?
Well, an example would be maybe my therapist saying to me, I think that there's something that you want to say that you're not quite saying. I mean, certainly a focusing therapist might do that, but it isn't the emphasis. Or
Mhm.
the analyst saying, oh, what was your feeling about it when I said this or that? Or
Mhm.
the kinds of things that are very, very common for me to do in my practice, to ask about our interaction.
Mhm.
It was a little different today between us. Do you feel that? What is that?
Mhm.
Something came alive for me and maybe for you when that was said. Or
That's interesting because if a focusing oriented therapist does things like that, it sounds like they're being informed by something more than just the focusing.
hmm,
I mean, I've always been struck that in practice, you and I practice in a way that looks very similar, but we come from different understandings of what we're doing. Um, but what you're just talking about now, I think that's part of the crossing, the richness that comes from integrating crossing in some way, the psychoanalytic emphasis on the relationship. And there's some kind of guidance in the theory there about things that might be helpful to include or to notice or to say and not keep to yourself.
mhm.
Yeah.
I think that what the psychoanalytic training um, gave me
Mhm.
is the greater implications to me of what Gene was teaching, but they weren't implications to him, and we led to real disagreement because for me, there I'm being informed by a felt sense of the us,
Mhm.
a feeling in the room that isn't just in me or just in the other person. And of course,
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what it is for the other person, but to cultivate a felt sense of the us felt like an expansion, and felt like very, very much in keeping with uh, with Jean's uh, basic premise that we are this larger interaction. That's what we're made
Mhm.
of, and of course,
Mhm.
we have a sense of it. We
Mhm.
have a felt sense of uh, not only a client, but of our society or anything that we tune into. Um, so I think Gene and I at one point, I think it's even recorded, there was this disagreement where I said something about the felt sense of the us, and he said, "Oh no, the felt sense is yours. You can have a felt sense of the other," but he objected to the felt sense of the us. And for me, that's a natural implication of of his philosophy. And the
Yeah.
idea that we disagreed, that he would only pay attention to the therapy relationship if there was something wrong.
Yeah.
And that felt so ironic to me and so um, contradictory, that, of course, explicating anything carries it forward. So you're only going to pay attention to what's wrong in the relationship. I mean, that seems so um, wrong-headed to me. But another way of thinking about it that I got to later was that I was sort of carrying forward with the crossing the implications of his premise of being interaction, and that was a piece that I wanted to fill in, that that he did fill in some ways, but in some ways he didn't.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was tension there, maybe for him as a person, in terms of his principle of interaction first, and the fact that when there's two people together, there's one situation that you're sensing, even if you're sensing it in different ways.
Right.
That and his wanting somehow to protect the uniqueness of the other, and to not have the therapist sort of imposing or intruding or getting in the way of what's unfolding in the other person.
Yes.
I think it caused a tension for him.
Yes.
If I could just say one other thing, the way that I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and the way that I sometimes think about it is when you find the right word in focusing, or the right image or something, that handle that kind of touches the experience and sort of allows it to move in some way, to release or to show more of itself or something, that if you're with another person, that felt sensing isn't just of one's own felt sense as though it's inside of the body.
Right.
That it's also, you're also symbolizing the felt sense of the being together. And if you can find a word or an image or something that somehow arises from and touches the feeling of the relationship, then that changes both people's bodies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That whole idea that when you can find a way of symbolizing something that's implicit, that it gives birth to it in a different way, and it makes us something more.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how you came to existentialism and the crossing for you with existentialism.
Just looking at the time, I know we don't have too much time. I came to I don't know how to answer that, to be honest. The best I can do now is to say, I think that people that get into existentialism are born weird. I don't, it's not an interest. It's something about where one stands in life or something. So I was attracted to existentialism when I was very young, reading existential novels and maybe struggling and trying to read Heidegger and Sartre, and understanding extremely little of it. But interestingly, especially with Heidegger, feeling my body change as I was trying to read this convoluted philosophy that conceptually and intellectually I couldn't understand. But I remember once having struggled to read something, going out to a McDonald's and standing in the queue waiting to place my order, and feeling so different. I really felt so broad and present. So I don't know if something was going in, or if there's something in the struggle itself that made me more alive. But if you change the question to existential psychotherapy, the thing that I loved about existential psychotherapy is it allowed me to ask any question. Up until then, I had trainings, especially psychoanalysis in the UK, which I think is probably different than in the United States, where there were some questions you weren't allowed to ask. And you couldn't critique the approach except from within the approach. You couldn't bring something from outside of psychoanalysis and to critique psychoanalysis. So I felt like this was too much like a cult for me. I needed to be free to ask any question. And when I did my existential training, that's what I found just so inspiring and so exciting, was I could ask any question. I remember being in one of my supervision sessions and saying something about a client talking about their memories of their childhood, and the supervisor listening and saying, "Is that how time works?" I was like, really? You can question time? Um, and that's my attraction to existential philosophy and phenomenology, is it allows really profound questions. It sort of continues to wake me up from the assumptions that I end up imposing upon myself. The problem with it, and what focusing or Gendlin's work saves it from, is it can become too conceptual, and it can become like a philosophical discussion that is not at all experience near. When I listen to some existential therapists talking about their work, often they don't talk about their work. They just talk about the more conceptual ideas or the philosophy. And I listen and I want to stop them at the end of each sentence and ask them, well, what do you mean by the 6 words in that sentence? But you don't get a chance to do that, to bring it down to the experience and to the body. So it's a frustrating crossing for me, because in the focusing world, sometimes I feel it's not kind of deep enough or something. I don't know what the right adjective is. And in the existential world, I feel the same. I feel in a totally different way, it's not deep enough.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, and then it's wonderful to ask the question. I love Jean's question, what do you want the word deep to mean, right?
Yeah, because it has almost oppositional meanings in those two
Yes,
uses.
yes. But if you give that a moment, what is the felt sense of the deep?
I would have to do it in both places.
Mm-hmm.
So the deep I'm looking for in the focusing world is a deep that wants to live with the truth of what's real. And for me, that isn't always really positive. In the focusing world, it can become sometimes a little too positive, a little too wonderful. And I want a little more of the truth that's like a big gong ringing, that kind of truth that just makes your whole being resonate. And sometimes those truths they sound more pessimistic. And I miss that depth, because they don't feel pessimistic to me, but they can sound pessimistic if you're in a culture that is quite optimistic or positive, or I'm not sure how else to say that, but that would be the deep on that side.
Let me try to say that back a bit.
Yeah, maybe you've got better words.
Well, not better words, but the feeling of something, the gong sort of shattering some illusions, and the sense of the feeling of the truth, not a particular truth, but the feeling of, oh wow, this is what life is to me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Not being afraid to go there, to that place that's almost shattering, but opens you up rather than shattering you, but going right to that
exactly.
edge of what you can stand, of the bigness. And the bigness isn't always, soothing or
only soothing to the extent that the truth feels better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's that's certainly a focusing principle.
Yes.
The truth is what feels better. The truth
Yeah.
is this experience that
Yeah.
feels connected,
Yes.
better connectedness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The deep on the other side is where something is being said conceptually, and I want to have a bodily experience of it. I want to say to the existential therapist, what are you meaning by authenticity right now?
Mm-hmm.
What is authenticity?
Mm-hmm.
But not what is it conceptually? What is it? How do you know when it's there? And I want it to go down into the body, into experience, and then to go further away from the term into different metaphors.